Welcome back to my channel. I'm Joe with Smokin Joe's Pet Barbecue. On today's video, I'm going to be smoking up two different briskets. One is going to be the traditional way that I normally smoke a brisket, and two is going to have a secret ingredient that supposedly Franklin Barbecue uses on their briskets. Stay tuned. All right, so I'm just going to start trimming these briskets. Now these are 12.5 pounds that we're starting with. And one thing that I noticed when I went to Franklin Barbecue a couple of years ago was that the briskets weren't really big. In fact, they were probably 5 or 6 pounds, and that's smoked. So that means that they started with a 10-pound brisket or so. So, oh my goodness, look at this nice gash on this brisket. That's okay, we can work around that. So I'm just going to trim up some of this fat on the top side of it. Now, I'm not the first one to cook a brisket using some Wagyu fat. In fact, it was Jeremy Yoder that came out with that video, and I found it really interesting. And I too noticed that when I went to Franklin Barbecue, that the butcher paper that the briskets are wrapped in was really soaked. I mean, more so than any brisket that I've ever smoked. Now, I always use butcher paper, and the paper does get soaked and some of the fat and the beef tallow that renders off the brisket. But when I was at Franklin Barbecue, I did notice that there was an excessive amount on their butcher paper. Just round off the edges. All right, so if you notice, this brisket sits really high up on this side, and the reason for it is because we have this fat pocket right here, okay? Now what I like to do is just reach in there and dig most of that out so that this brisket lays nice and flat. Just want to carve a good chunk of this fat out. And I am wearing a cut glove, so I'm getting pretty close to my hand, but I'm not too worried because I do have a cut glove on, okay? So just carve that piece of fat out. Just like that. A little bit more actually. And then we will lay that brisket down flat. Okay, you can see that it's laying nice and flat now. All right, so I'm looking for about 1/4 inch of fat on the fat cap side. So I'm just going to trim this down a little bit. Get that nice white fat exposed. So one thing I like to do to my briskets is just make them aerodynamic. So I'm just going to cut the corners off and make them nice and round. Now this makes a big difference. That way your corners don't burn up inside the smoker. Okay, just like that. Trim up this corner as well. All right, so we got our corners nice and rounded. This brisket is looking good. I'm gonna trim up the other one, and I'll bring you guys right back. All right, so I've got both briskets trimmed up. I'm just gonna move one aside here. All right, so this brisket right here is the one that's gonna have the secret ingredient, and it's not so secret anymore. I'm gonna be using some Wagyu beef tallow as a binder, and also when I wrap, okay? So I just melted some of this Wagyu beef tallow down, and I put it in a squeeze bottle that you see right here. So I'm just gonna apply a good coating on both sides of my brisket. And the reason I'm doing this is to see if the brisket tastes better, is it juicier, and just compare it to the normal way that I smoke a brisket, okay? So again, I'm using some Wagyu beef tallow as a binder for this brisket. And I will be leaving a link inside the description box on where you can order your Wagyu beef tallow that has multiple uses, not just for briskets and steaks, but you can also make tortillas, you can make bread, you can do a lot of things with it. So as you can see, that Wagyu beef tallow starts to solidify on the surface. That's gonna create a nice tacky surface for our rubs to stick to. So the very first rub that I'm using is from LC Barbecue. This is just a base layer. Okay, this is their rawhide seasoning. Just gonna apply a good layer of this. This is acting as an SPG. Grab the fat cap side. So supposedly at Franklin Barbecue, they just use salt and pepper. And I don't know, I beg to differ. There's something else in there. Now I have cooked a salt and pepper brisket before, and I'm not a big fan. Now I did cook a brisket with salt only, and that was absolutely delicious. All right, so the second rub that I'm using today is this Texas rib grind from Chicken Fried Barbecue, and I absolutely love the flavor of this. I did smoke some ribs with it, and it's absolutely delicious. So I'm gonna apply a good hearty layer of this Texas rib grind. A lot of pepper, which is exactly the way I like my briskets. All right, so I'm just gonna set this aside, wash up my cutting board, and I'm gonna show you how I season my second brisket. All right, so I've got my second brisket, and my traditional brisket has a good layer of mustard as a binder. So this brisket right here was pretty mangled up. The butcher cut the flat up really bad, so I tried to fix it as much as possible. And sometimes I wish they weren't in that cryovac so you can really look at that brisket, make sure you're getting a good brisket, not something with gouges like the way this one was, but we're gonna make it work. All right, same rubs, the LC Barbecue Rawhide as a base layer, followed by the Texas Rib Grind from Chicken Fried Barbecue. So I'm gonna be smoking these briskets fat cap up on my Yoda Frontiersman. I've got it warming up at 275 degrees. We'll see you guys there. All right, so I've got my smoker running at 275 degrees. I'm gonna place a brisket on the top left side of my smoker. So here's my traditional brisket, pointing towards that firebox. And here's our Wagyu beef tallow brisket. And the surface is really mushy, I can tell you that right out of the gate. I'm just gonna slide the shelf in. So I'm gonna give these briskets 2.5 hours. We're gonna come back at that point and check that bark formation and see if there's a difference between the Wagyu beef tallow and the traditional way that I smoke a brisket. Stay tuned. All right, so 2.5 hours into our cook, let's take a look at our briskets. Now I haven't spritzed or anything, okay? Ooh, I see something really different between both of these briskets. So this brisket right here is where we use that Wagyu beef tallow, and the surface is really moist. So this brisket right here is my traditional brisket, and that surface is really dry. Okay, that bark is definitely set. This surface is still really moist, okay? So there is a significant difference, and this is throughout the entire brisket. As you can see, this surface is really dry. So this is where I normally start to spritz with apple cider vinegar and water. So obviously I need to spritz this one because the surface is dry and my bark is set. So from this point on, I'm gonna be spritzing every 30 minutes, okay? Now this one, the surface is still really nice and moist, so I'm not gonna spritz this one. But my traditional brisket, I will. I'm gonna slide the shelf back in. We'll check back as soon as I wrap these. Stay tuned. All right, so it's been 4.5 hours. Now this is the brisket that we use the Wagyu beef tallow on, and the surface is still really nice and moist. The fat has kind of pooled up in a couple of spots. So I did not spritz this brisket whatsoever. The internal temperature of this brisket is 175 degrees, okay? Have a really nice bark, and that bark is definitely set. So I'm gonna use some more of the Wagyu beef tallow. Now this is what Jeremy Yoder did, is he put it on the butcher paper. So I'm gonna put on the butcher paper as well. And I'm also gonna apply a little bit on the top of the brisket and the bottom. Just like that. Get it really nice and wet. All right, so now I'm just gonna wrap it up in butcher paper. So the fat cap is on the bottom there. Really nice and tight. Now the fat cap is back up on the top. Now this excess butcher paper, what I like to do is just fold it and stuff it on the bottom, okay? Just like that. So I'm gonna pop this back inside the smoker and I'll bring you guys right back. All right, so here's our second brisket. Now this is the one where I use mustard as a binder, and that surface is definitely much drier, but I have been spritzing with apple cider vinegar and water. So I'm just gonna add a little bit more of my spritz, get it nice and wet. Now this is what I normally do when I smoke a brisket or if I'm catering briskets, is I just spritz with apple cider vinegar and water. Just wet it down really nice. Okay, just like that. Go ahead and wrap her up. All right, just like that. Back in the smoker it goes. We'll see you guys back when these are ready. Stay tuned. All right, so both briskets are ready. Now this is my regular brisket. This one was done in 8 hours. The brisket where we use the Wagyu beef tallow, this one was ready in 7 hours. And I gotta tell you, I've smoked a ton of briskets and never have I had one come up to temperature in 7 hours, okay? So I'm thinking that Wagyu beef tallow had something to do with it. Now, obviously right out of the gate, you can see the wrapper is drenched, and this is our standard one, which is kind of drenched as well on the bottom. So I'm just gonna take this brisket out of the butcher paper, and they have been resting for a couple of hours, but I can tell they're still really hot. All right, so we do have some moisture on the surface of this brisket, and it's really tender. Look at that, okay? All right, so let's unwrap our Wagyu beef tallow brisket. And obviously this package is drenched. Look at this. There's a lot more au jus on the inside of this butcher paper. So let me just lift this one up. Ooh, man, this one is really tender as well. But look at this. Look at how juicy this brisket is compared to the other one. Okay, so right out of the gate, our Wagyu beef tallow brisket does have a lot more moisture. All right, so just a couple of comparisons. Aside from the juiciness of these briskets, this one does wiggle a little bit more, and that bark is a little bit darker. So this brisket has a really nice bark, but it does not jiggle as much as this one, okay? So let me grab my cutting board, and I'll bring you guys right back. All right, so let's slice into our traditional brisket. This little bad boy right here. Okay, I'm gonna cut the point off. Oh my goodness. That is extremely tender. Got a little bit of bark over here on the backside. That's okay. All right, so check that baby out right there. Nice and juicy. Nothing wrong with this point. And look at that juiciness. It is just dripping, okay? So that looks really good. Let's take a couple of slices. I'm just gonna cut this piece off right here, this thinner area. Let's take some slices from right here. Slicing really nice and tender. Nothing wrong with this flat right here. Good smoke ring as well. Look at that. Okay, just a good looking brisket. Okay, nice and juicy, nice and tender, pulls right apart. Okay, just gonna move these aside. I'll take a couple slices off of my point here, just for a comparison. Okay, look at that, nice and juicy. Okay, I'm gonna leave a piece of the point and also one of my slices for my regular brisket up here. Not a bad brisket. Now let's bring in the star of the show and see what we got here. Same thing, I'm gonna cut the point off. Ooh, this is really tender. Much more tender than the other brisket. Now what I like to do with this piece right here is just cut it off and you get some nice burnt ends out of this whole edge that's right here. Okay, so you can do that. There's a couple of burnt ends right there. Let's cut this one in half. Oh my goodness, that cuts like butter. And you guys saw it, okay? I'm not making this stuff up. So look at that. Really nice and juicy as well. Take a couple slices off of my point. Man, that is super tender. That is ridiculous. Look at that. All right, so let's take some slices off the flat. Just gonna take this piece off right here. And let's get into our slices. Ooh, man. This slice is extremely tender. That fat is nice and yellow, which is something that I noticed on the Franklin barbecue briskets as well. Their fat had a yellow kind of tint to it. So I'm getting into the point here, so just gonna move this aside. So I got into the point, so I'm just gonna take this off just for a comparison's sake. And this is a thick slice, okay? So look at that, comes right apart. So look at that, this is a real thick slice, and it's just a lot more tender than this brisket right here. Okay, you can kind of see it right there. But look at that. We got a clapper right here. This one will clap as well, but this one's much more tender. Look at that. All right, let's give them a taste. All right, let's give these briskets a try and see how we did. First, I'm gonna try my traditional brisket. Just pick up the slice. Here we go. All right, so there is nothing wrong with this brisket right here. Really nice and tender. Nice and juicy as well, has a really good flavor. Now let's try our Wagyu brisket. Same thing, I'm just gonna take a bite. Here we go. Wow. So now I'm gonna try a piece of the point off my traditional brisket. Then we'll try the Wagyu beef tallow brisket as well, okay? So here we go, got me a good chunk. All right, there is nothing wrong with this point right here. Really nice and tender, so full of flavor. Now we're gonna try our Wagyu beef tallow point. Here we go. Wow, I can't believe it. This point is super tasty, really nice and tender, and the meat, it just falls apart the minute I put it in my mouth. This is really good. So overall, I gotta tell you, I don't know if this is Franklin's secret or not, but there is something very special about the Wagyu beef tallow that I used as a binder and also when I wrapped in the butcher paper. Now I do want to show you one thing here real quick as well. So my beef tallow brisket has a totally different color compared to my traditional style brisket. This slice kind of dried up just sitting there, and this one is still really nice and juicy. Two totally different colors. Hopefully you guys can see it on the camera. I am surprised by the results of this Wagyu beef tallow brisket. So I don't know if using the beef tallow on a brisket is a Franklin barbecue secret or not, but I am definitely going to be doing this again. I'm going to be leaving a couple of links inside the description box on where you can get the rubs that I use in this video, and also some of this Wagyu beef tallow. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you did, do me a favor and hit that thumbs up. If this is your first time here, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. If you have any questions, ask them down below. Until next time, Joe with Smokin Joe Spit Barbecue. See ya.